Good morning. I'm Hedgeye's president, Michael Blum. It is the day after the general election in the United States. Welcome to our show. I have with me Hedgeye's managing director for demography research, noted historian, economist, author Neil Howe, and managing director of our macro policy unit in Washington, D.C., JT Taylor. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Wow, it
It
was
is
an
morning,
Good
right?
morning. It was an exciting night. It was a very late one, even for me here on the West Coast. Um, I wonder whether we are a country maybe just a little bit less divided. I mean, I didn't have Donald Trump blowing out the Electoral College, which it certainly looks like it's not even going to be close by the time everything is said and done. It appears that there might be fairly clear majorities in the Senate. I'm not sure that we have the same clarity for the House yet. What do we make of this in the greater historical context here this morning?
Um, Michael, this is one of the great political comeback stories in American history, right? People had really given up on Trump politically after 2020. He kind of disappeared, and people were, I don't know, the Republican Party wasn't sure what they're going to do. This is an amazing story. How he came back so decisively. I think it's going to end up, it's very likely to end up over 300 electoral college votes for Trump. I think 306 is probably the number if these states sort of stay where they're going. Uh, and unbelievably, he's going to win the popular vote, probably by about 3 percentage points. That is from losing the popular vote by over 4 percentage points 4 years ago. I mean, that is a huge comeback, right? I don't know what to say. JT, anything to add to that?
No, I mean it's spot on. It's a complete turnaround. We had talked, I think, on our last segment with DJ about whether or not the race could go one way or the other, and a little bigger, and it obviously went bigger for Trump. I just say the one thing I will, and I know you're going to get into some exit polls, Neil, but I was startled, and I shouldn't be that shocked, but the number of voters, how long have we been in this business? And you go back to the old Reagan adage, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I think it came down to the economy, and I think the economy did impact newer demographics that I know you can speak to in a second. Whether or not there's a massive realignment going on, I think is a topic for another day, but there's clearly a shift in especially with Hispanics right now, very, very market shift with Hispanics right now. But when you look at exit polling in the economy, 65 to 67% thought it was poor or maybe fair at best. And then there was a 40% gap between Harris and Trump from a voting standpoint. That's pretty massive. And it does, people vote their pocketbook.
They
It
they they
can't
yeah.
dismiss that ever again.
They vote the pocketbook, even if it's just vibes. I mean,
Yep.
that's obviously how people felt. And we're going to get to the demographics here. One big story, absolutely Latinos. That was the single thing that just jumped out.
Yep.
And the other thing is, and this gets to Michael's comment about the nation feeling a bit more unified, is what's remarkable about Trump's performance. His biggest gains were in deep blue states. We're going to get to that in a second. Huge gains in New York, California. Now, he obviously didn't win those states, but the better performance over 2020 was double digits. It was
Yep.
like 10, 11%. He just barely eked out Pennsylvania and Michigan. You know what I mean? And this is interesting because it's actually a less regionally divided country than it was before. If you see where I'm going with this,
Yep.
So
um,
I want to maybe break our discussion into two parts. Neil, I think we're going to start off maybe with a bit of a retrospective and have a look at some of the numbers and your observations. And then in the second part of the conversation, I want to look forward and talk about where we go from here, because the situation is obviously very different than, including what we were all preparing for last night. I was speaking to JT very early this morning. We had a whole show prepared on legal challenges and how do we actually get to figuring out who the president is? That's all behind us now. So where do we
well,
actually
now
going
we're
from
gonna
here in the second
and
half of
we
the
can also
conversation?
talk about trades. We can actually, what happened to the peso, what happened to the yuan, What's happening to bond yields, the 10-year, these have changed overnight, as you know. Let's quickly go through first chart. Put it up there. I guess it's up there. Hold on a second.
Yep.
At least I can't see it.
It's up there.
Okay. So this basically gives a story. As I say, I think it's very likely that Michigan, Arizona at least, and if Nevada goes too, I believe it's 306, right? That will end up at 306. So that's where we go from there. Next chart. This is what's amazing. This is the county by county shift. Two Democrats or two Republicans from 2020. Take a look at that. It's just a forest of red spikes. And you can see a few little areas there, for instance, around Atlanta, a few places where you see a little blue, but there's not much, right, where you can say that the Democrats perform better than 2020. And I want to take a look at a few states in 1 second here. Let's take a look. Next chart. This is Florida. I don't know about you, JT, but this is the first thing that came up last night.
Yep.
And it was just amazing. I mean, look at these spikes are 12, 13 percentage points all over the state from where they did in 2020. Now, in 2020, Trump won Florida by 3.3 percentage points. He won at this time by 13.1 percentage points. Wow. That's a 10 percentage point improvement in performance. Another random state I thought I'd choose, next chart. This is New York, a deep blue state, obviously. In 2020, Biden won this state by 23.5%. Harris won it by 10.8%. That's what I'm talking about, Michael. This is a 12 percentage point shift in New York. And you can see the shift is all over. It's particularly down in Manhattan, obviously overwhelmingly for the Democrats, but still much less overwhelming than it was before. And one last one, just to show you the difference, is Pennsylvania. Obviously, the critical swing state. It turned out to be the critical swing state. Again, Republicans performing much better this election virtually everywhere. But take a look at the difference. In 2020, Biden won it by 0.02%. That was very close, right? He just won it by a sliver. Trump won it by 2.3%. So again, only like a 2 percentage point improvement on the battleground state. So the Electoral College popular vote threshold has actually diminished in this election. That's my point there. Next chart. Let's just enter some gender polls. No real news here. I should say that these are CNN exit polls. These are all a little bit biased toward Harris. Women vote more than men. You'd expect, given these numbers, that Harris actually would have won the election, or at least won the popular vote. But what's important here is just the relative amounts. Obviously, still a very large gender gap. That really hasn't gone away. Next chart. This is the Latino story, but take a look at this. Black men, it rose a little bit from 2020. I believe the figure, JT, is 25% of black men voted for Trump. And I think that was, that raised a few eyebrows.
Yeah.
But you look at the Latino men and Latina women, look at that. And look at this complete inversion. Trump winning Latino men of all ages by 10%. I mean, that's a lot right there.
The funny thing there, Neil, is that the Democrats saw this coming a mile away years ago.
Hedgeye's Cyber November deal is here. Get the best deals we offer all year. Scan the QR code to find out more.
And I'm kind of shocked that they underperformed at this level, and despite Trump's final closing message. So, but it's remarkable that they kind of caught on to this a little late. But Biden's numbers were, as you point out here, Biden's numbers were better than hers were, and yet it almost collapsed. They're still getting the majority of it, but they've got a long way to go. I suspect we're going to see another Remember 2012, you had that Republican autopsy? I think you're going to see a
Yeah.
Democratic autopsy here in the next couple of
I,
weeks.
I think you are. And some of those biggest spikes, by the way, in Texas, better performance in 2020, we're right along the border, like Brownsville, all those huge spikes. Those are all Latinos, right? Anyway, next chart here. Okay, educational divide. Now this just cements, what I have called the, seventh great realignment, which really started in 2016. This just cements it. Higher educated voters have moved to the Democratic Party. Lower educated voters have moved to the Republican Party. And that actually generates what, I think was the key to understanding this race: non-response bias and high turnout skew. We've talked about that in previous broadcasts we've done. But you can see this. Actually, white men, whites with degrees actually drifted a little bit toward the Democratic Party, but you see here, it's really people without degrees that were really pushing Trump. Next chart, younger voters. This election is the key deciding the key decision maker in this election is Generation X. I mean, take a look at this. Americans born in the 60s and 70s, they elected Trump. Take a look at every other age bracket. It voted to some extent for Harris. You see, millennials. But what's interesting is that these younger people voted less for Democrats than they did back in 2020 and 2016. But I've always maintained, and this just confirms it, Gen X has always been the most pro-Trump age bracket. They continue to be here. Take a look at that.
Yeah.
And they represent by far the single most voting age bracket right now. So
And what do you attribute the Gen Z guys, the younger ones? That's the one, other than the Hispanic vote, the one really stark issue that stuck out to me were younger voters. It felt that there was going to be more of a pro-Harris gap there, and it was pretty damn close.
Well, it's the bro vote, sort of neutralizing the women. We talked about that in our last broadcast. There's no question that the young women were very heavily for Harris, but now they're being neutralized. You see, young women voting for the Democratic Party. We saw that back in 2016, 2020. This is new, right? This trend of young men in their early 20s voting for Trump.
The Joe Brogan vote.
Yeah. Well, that certainly helped.
So bad. Sorry.
And then next chart, family income. Again, this is just cementing, not just high versus low education, but high versus low income. And you can see the Republican Party has officially become the party of lower income people. I mean, take a look at this. And this is clearer than it was back in 2016 or 2020. And you can also just see it by how well Democrats and Harris did in high income counties. I mean, whether it's Northern Virginia or you're looking at New York or California or wherever you're looking, Democrats did better in the high income places. You can see this divide here. Religion, it's interesting. No real surprises here. The Jewish vote, a lot of controversy on that. It's a very small N size, only 2%. Apparently in Fox News, this is more like 30% voted for Trump. This is a big issue in the Jerusalem Times. And there's a big commentary now in Israel about this and wringing of hands. But it did not seem, at least according to CNN, that Trump pulled in a lot more Jewish American voters, because of what's happened since October 7th last year. But there you kind of see it broken down. Next chart. Early voting, and again, overall turnout, we can see where early voting was. We did have really strong early voting this year. It looks as though when I look at overall turnout, I think I said we're about 90% in terms of total vote of where we were in 2020. The vote still hasn't all been counted. I expect us to be right close to where we were in 2020, not quite. And that means the actual turnout's going to be somewhat lower than 2020. It's still going to be historically high turnout year, not quite at 2020 levels. Next chart. Well, you know, you can comment on this. I'll tell you, in my opinion, and we can talk about why, but this is going to end up at either 53 or 54. JT, maybe you have an opinion about this. I mean, as I read it, Dave McCormick is now leading Bob Casey in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
By about
and Brown is leading Rosen slightly in Nevada, and then we have Slotkin slightly up in Michigan, as well as
very close
Tammy Baldwin up in Michigan. So 2 for 2. But right now, the Senate Republicans number 52, and they could stand to pick up 2 more. I think it's going to be all 4 of these remaining races are going to be tight to the finish. I suspect that the most northeastern ones will stay. That I think Pennsylvania is going to be a toss-up, and Michael, you're there in Nevada. I think Rosen might pull that one out, but here's why the number matters beyond 52, in my opinion. If Trump does have a so-called mandate, 52 in the Senate, you do have 2 very moderate senators in Senator Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Collins of Maine, and they're going to operate as sort of the queen makers, if you will. You had Joe Manchin as the kingmaker in the last Congress, and everything had to go through Joe Manchin's office. Every piece of Biden legislation had to go through and get Manchin's stamp of approval. Same thing holds true with Collins and Murkowski. To the extent you want to get beyond those 2, then you're going to have to increase your number to 53 or 54. And again, I think they'll probably get to 53. I'd be surprised if they got to 54, but not shocked.
Yeah.
But this is big because this is where, again, the Trump agenda will be implemented, and we'll get to the House in a second. Michael, any comments on the Senate that I need to bring up?
No, I think we got that.
No, but the surprise is Bob Casey, because the vote is almost counted in Pennsylvania, right? And he's losing. He's behind by 0.8%. That's a lot to make up. So
yeah,
that's one flip right there.
Yeah, and so across the board, again, I keep getting the question, and Neil, you could comment on this. Why were Democratic Senate candidates polling better than Harris in some of these states? And I said to Michael beforehand, it's because some of these senators are known entities. And Harris, 3 months into it, 3.5 years into the Biden administration, not only was she tethered to Joe Biden, she still was an unknown. And so I think that's in large part, and you may have a different perspective, Neil, but these senators, whether it's Rosen, whether it's Casey, who could very well lose here now, there's constituent services. They're all over their constituents know them. And I don't care what party you belong to, every once in a while you do favor or you are fond of your home state senator. He or she has brought home the bacon at some point, helped you with a constituent service. So there's not that animosity, if you will, as you have for the opposing presidential candidate at times.
I'll push back on that just a little bit, JT. Yeah. I mean, this storyline kind of started last night when it didn't look great. And I think it was Dana Bash on CNN who started talking about, oh, maybe Harris didn't have enough time to introduce herself to the voters. I actually don't buy into that. Speaking here specifically in the state of Nevada, I've actually never thought that the Republican candidates for Senate, who we've put up, for about 10 years here now, are actually particularly good. They tend to be very much on the conservative spectrum, and don't really appeal to the middle ground, which is at the end of the day, I think, where you need to win an election, certainly here in the state of Nevada. Sam Brown is kind of in that same cut out of the same cloth. I'm actually shocked that it's close and that he could win. I think that shows you just how far the Democrats have lost the electorate in general, and especially here in the state of Nevada. So I don't buy into this people didn't know Harris that well argument, but hopefully we'll get some additional data. And I think this is all going to be part of a postmortem.
And I think you're right. I think while it might not be knowing that candidate. I also think there's a candidate quality issue, as you pointed out. So it's a combo, in my opinion. Take Kari Lake in Arizona,
Yeah, I mean, that
and
should have been
or
a
Robinson in
Republican
North
pickup.
Carolina.
Yeah, that
Well,
should have been a Republican pickup, but she's not a great candidate, right?
Yeah,
So,
awful.
no, but
and this
here's
is
the
Candidate
thing.
quality at the end of the day.
Kari Lake is an exception in this race. She was more the rule in 2022.
Yep.
Yep.
Meaning just really not good candidate. That's when Mitch McConnell was talking about the candidate quality problem on the Republican side. And I think a lot of that was Trump stepping back from trying to select all the Senate candidates, which really helped the Republicans this time.
Yep.
And by the way, that Arizona race is close. I don't think she's going to win, but I didn't have that down as a 3 or 4% race. I thought she was going to get blown out of the water. So it's amazing actually that the Democrats aren't outperforming there as I think they probably should have, or certainly had the potential to.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go
What about
on.
Congress. When
Congress.
do we get a clearer picture of Congress?
Well, I don't know. I rely on JT for
Yeah.
this. JT, what do you see?
So I suspect within the next 24 hours, we'll have in our country's interior, if you will, you'll have some of these races being called. And if the Republicans don't have, a 4 or 5 seat edge at that point, then it's going to come down to California and 5 to be called seats in California, and that may take a while by virtue of absentee ballots. There's some that are postmarked. They just take their time counting things, going through things, are very, very deliberate. I said to Michael earlier, I don't know why they can't operate like others, even Georgia and Pennsylvania. You have these other battleground states with millions of votes and voters in multiple polling places. I know California is massive, but they do have different rules in California. And I think one of them happens to be they wait a couple of days for mail-in ballots to come in.
Yep.
Whereas in other states, if you're not in by Tuesday, bye-bye. So it might be a little while, but let's see how. I think within the next 24 hours, we'll have an idea of how some of the races still in New York State go. Pennsylvania, there are a couple of toss-ups. I think right across the river here in Virginia, Oregon, and even Arizona. There are a bunch of races to be called, and let's see what the breakdown is. Probably around this time tomorrow, and then we'll make a call whether or not they may win enough to make the call for the Republicans now. But I'd rather be, let's just put it this way, Neil and Michael, I'd rather be in the Republican shoes right now, looking at the House and the Democratic shoes, just given the trends countrywide. But again, I'd say there's a slightly less than even chance that it might come down to California.
Yeah, and I will say this is where Trump performing better in deep blue states really helps him.
Yep.
Because it's in the congressional races, right? Where you actually have that you get the coattails, you get more people voting for Trump. They're more likely to just vote down the ticket. And that's great for Trump. That's great for the Republicans in California, in New York, right?
Yep. And I was wrong. Clearly, throughout the election, I felt that, well, not throughout the election, but given Harris's entry into the race, I felt that she was going to bolster candidates in California. It might work the opposite right now.
Yeah, well, particularly where we were looking at is more Central Valley and sort of that eastern part of California, which is definitely tipping toward the red zone anyway. And
there's still some toss-ups out there, and to be decided. Even Colorado has a race that hasn't been determined yet. So
yeah, but as we pointed out, there were 5 California races that were among the top 12 spending congressional races in the country.
Yep,
there's a huge amount of contests going on the West Coast. So yeah,
I had a question on this spending, and I suffered through this here in Nevada. Honestly, we should have the right to sue the state for bodily injury or something like that. It was absurd. I mean, every day there were flyers at the house. I live in a gated community, so nobody can knock on my door, thank God. But couldn't turn on the radio, couldn't stream anything, couldn't turn on the television. I mean, it was just it was really mentally destabilizing. Then I heard I wasn't even aware of this. Did they put $500 million into the Senate race in Ohio? I mean, this is not a good allocation of capital for the American people.
I don't see a half a
What?
billion, but there were, I think a record number was spent in Ohio in the Senate race. And that was
Okay.
one of the big players in this, in one of the soon to be told stories of this election is crypto money in this election. I think I may have mentioned on the call late last week, Neil, that and Michael, that the crypto industry, if you look at PAC money raised in Washington, D.C., surpassed the total expenditure that all of corporate America put in PAC money.
Wow.
One industry equaled or surpassed all of other corporate money. And I know they played big time in Ohio. Sherrod Brown, Senator Sherrod Brown, now soon to be ex-Sherrod Brown, was a anti, if you will, I don't want to say a foe of the industry. Maybe he was a foe of the industry, but he was not well liked by the industry. And so they played hard in that. So I think that's why you're seeing a bigger number there. But this is going to be apostasy to some people watching this. But after this election and listening to you, Michael, maybe I'll get you on my side. I believe in publicly financed campaigns.
Well, I mean, this is sort of my
I'm not.
question. Where can this go? I mean, it's crazy the amount of money that's being blown up here, right? I mean, nice for the media companies that can charge for the advertising, but again, not a good allocation of our capital.
Not at all.
You
It's
know,
good.
I'll take a little dissenting viewpoint here. We probably spend more money on Mars candy bars and stuff. I mean, have you ever looked and compared, national consumption? I don't think we spend a lot. After all, we're choosing our chief executive and our nation's legislative leadership. You and now you might not like how people are approached and what works with people, Michael. But that's a democracy, right? People reach out in the ways that work, for better or for worse. That's what our people are about. Speaking of crypto, though, I will
Wait, says the guy from West Virginia who probably got no ads.
no ads whatsoever. Blissful peace, splendid isolation. I live up here on my mountain. No one bothered me. But I'll tell you, speaking of crypto, since 4:30 yesterday afternoon, Bitcoin is up, what, 7.3%. And let's talk a little bit about that. Then we'll go into JT about, political stuff. But I'm just talking about sort of the Trump trade. And I thought it was really interesting. Obviously, equities up, peso versus dollar down 2.4%, a won versus dollar down 1.3%, and the 10-year yield up 30 basis points. I believe I just looked this morning, 4.56, up from what, 4.28 yesterday afternoon. This is the Trump trade, right? I mean, this is what people, you're going to blow out deficits. I mean, he's even talking about getting rid of income taxes. I mean, what the heck? I mean, if I remember Dick Cheney's comment. This must have been 20 years ago when he said, "Well, didn't Reagan prove the deficits don't matter?" And if that becomes the reigning wisdom of the Republican Party, well, this is what people are trading on, right? So and that actually does get a little bit to JT, because it's a little bit, okay, people are trading on these expectations. What is the actual policy people are going to be putting in here, and who's Trump going to be choosing, and how's that going to work out?
Yeah,
So I think that's kind of the discussion that we wanted to get into a little bit, JT. Let's assume for a second that we're going to have a Republican-controlled House, Senate, and obviously President Trump. He's got 2 years until the midterm elections, right? And what is he going to do differently this time around? It seems that he would be much more prepared than he was in 2016 to actually take the reins here. But what do you see happening here in the next 24 months?
Yeah, that's smart of you to point out the 2026 midterms, even though I curse you under my breath. But the Senate map changes in 2026, by the way, it probably favors the Democrats. So I think the Republicans, if they sweep, or as they're about to sweep, look at that. They're like, look, let's get everything done in the first 2 years. Let's not wait. And they're ready. You've got a number of this is a second time around. He's had a transition team in place. I know it might take a little flack for mentioning this, but there is a document called Project 2025 that the Democrats try to use as a cudgel against Trump and the Republicans. That was written by a lot of first-term Trump personnel. And I go by my adage, personnel is policy. Some of these people may return. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that Project 2025 is going to be adopted. I'm not even saying a majority of it will, but there are signs, indicators directionally where they might go in some of the agencies and sub-agencies. Again, so that is, I've had a lot of clients request that over the last 4 or 5 months in the event of a Trump victory or a Republican sweep. So they're going to front load it. They're going to bring on probably some experienced people, some inexperienced people. But remember this: he has a mandate now, and if there is a red sweep, there's about to be a red sweep, and he wins the popular vote as he's about to do, then he's going to feel, and he's already talked about a mandate, and they're going to move with all due dispatch to get there. Again, personnel is policy. Let's watch early on who he appoints to some of the big agencies, but more importantly, or as importantly, from a regulatory standpoint, you've got to look at who he's appointing to some of these sub-agencies as well. I mean, we've got tons of clients that are watching, as Paul Glencher will tell you, and Emily Evans will tell you, CMS, all the three-letter agencies here, the FTC, the FCC. Watch who goes into some of these spots. Watch who he staffs the White House with. So you're going to see it front-loaded with, there's going to have to be something done on immigration. That's something he talked about on day one. You're going to see something done on tariffs. If you are not paying attention to tariffs or the impact of tariffs, your head must be in the sand, because it's something he did the first time around, maybe a little bit more strategically or surgically the first time around, not as penal. I think the second time around is a little different. So pay attention to when he says the levels are going to be between 10 to 20% and up to 60% on China. Tax policy, I mean, we're going to spend all of 2025 talking about tax policy and the levels at which the Republicans are going to be able to make the 2017 TCJA permanent. And I do believe they'll get 80 to 90% of that done. They will have a debate, a discussion over corporate taxes and what level that will be, as well as personal taxes, as well as SALT. So there's a lot more on that front. Regulation. And then, of course, the foreign policy, I think on the onset, you're going to have to see what he does in the first couple of weeks with regard to Ukraine, and how he moves forward on that front. So I think they're ready. They have teams identified. They've been working on this for months. They have some blueprints. They've been through it before. They know where the minefields are, and they're going to be ready to go.
Hedgeye founder and CEO Keith McCullough's long-awaited new book, Master the Market, is available now. In this 52-page ebook, Keith McCullough distills decades of Wall Street experience into actionable insights. Discover how to navigate market cycles, avoid major losses, and invest with the confidence of a seasoned pro. Download your free copy right now. Go to hedgeye.com/book. That's hedgeye.com/book.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Tariffs. I totally agree with you. This is going to be different this time. It's not just going to be ad hoc like it was last time. He has a whole tariff philosophy. Tariffs, he said, a beautiful word. You remember that?
The most beautiful word in the world.
And the secret of American development throughout the late 19th century, in fact, throughout the entire 19th century. And he really has a whole historical view, which, there's some truth to that. That was back during those Republican administrations after the Civil War. The federal government basically did only two things during those decades. It collected tariff revenue, it ran the post offices, and it sent all that money out in benefit checks to the Grand Army of the Republic, all the Union veterans. That's basically all the federal government did, year after year. But he's going to bring that back. 60% on China. Now, China is apparently, by many people, has not unleashed its fiscal bazooka yet, precisely because they're waiting to see if this is going to happen. So apparently everyone's wondering why China hasn't really done a lot of stimulus. The thinking now is that they're waiting to see, and it looks like it may well happen. This is going to be their comeback to the and so what's that's going to mean is a lot more domestic consumption or investment. I don't know what China's going to do. It's going to have to look for big, it's going to have to look desperately for other export markets. Europe is going to come under a great deal of stress, obviously. Europe's going to have to respond to China, but that creates a very interesting situation. Trump did say, you remember, I'm not going to be a dictator except on day one. You remember that?
Yep.
And when he talked about what he was going to do as dictator, immigration, that was what he's going to do. Now, the president, by virtue of the executive power, has a lot of control over immigration policy. That was the GOP argument against Biden and Harris about why they were waiting for legislation. They constantly said, you have all kinds of executive powers. If you just used it, you could solve the problem. How big is that going to be for Trump on day one? Obviously, it was a huge issue for him throughout the campaign. He feels he has a mandate on that. Is he really going to set up those relocation camps? I don't know how luridly to talk about this, JT, but I want to bring it out here and talk about, are we talking about 10, 15 million people, rounding them up? Is that what ICE is going to do?
Yeah, that would be my instinct. I think that his inner circle will probably try to come up with something a little bit more methodical, and disciplined. And to the extent that they could talk him into it, that might be the approach. But we've seen this story before. If there's something he wants to get done, nothing's going to stop him from tweeting it, saying it, doing it. And if he says to his team, and they are preparing executive orders, we know this already. Again, when I go back to regulatory policy, they are ready to look at regulatory policy writ large across the federal government and start issuing executive orders. But on immigration, I suspect that he will act within the first days of his presidency. It's symbolic.
And it's something he can do. It's something
he can do.
Right.
You just have to, because then if not, then your base, his base and over 50% of the country is going to give him slack. We've already seen that, but I don't know how much longer he'd have before he could do something really significant.
I have a question for you guys. I have a question Ukraine. What is he going to do on Ukraine? As you know, the big problem with Ukraine, you can do a compromise or whatever, but the whole issue always comes down to who's going to guarantee a deal. And if it's not going to be the US.
Actually, I think this is a really interesting one. And obviously, being German and having followed the German press here in the run up to the election, and some of the other European press, I think the Europeans, the Germans in particular, are absolutely shocked in disbelief today that there will be a second Trump presidency. They did not believe the writing on the wall. They are completely unprepared. Don't forget, the German government is in this wacky coalition that's about to fall apart anyways. If there were elections, it's not clear what new divisions of power there would be, given the far right having outperformed here in recent state elections. I think at the EU level, there might be a little bit better preparation, but on the EU member state, especially looking at the key states here, France, Germany, the UK obviously isn't part of the EU anymore. They are not prepared for a Trump presidency and for trying to resolve the Ukraine issue on their own. I was more than surprised this weekend when I was reading some of the more conservative press in Germany stating that suddenly, Zelensky might have to enter into some kind of peace negotiations here. The Ukraine might have to give up some kind of territory. Even 10 days ago, these would have been absolutely unbelievable things for a
Michael,
politician to have mentioned.
the AFD and this new, Sarah Wagenknecht, this left-wing party in the AFD, they're already opposed to any help for Ukraine, and they're gaining in these state elections, right?
Yep.
So my point is Germany is already pushing that way. To me, though, it's not what deal are they going to strike. That's not the issue. Who's going to guarantee it? That's the issue. And if you poll Ukrainians, they'll say they would give up half their territory if the other half were let into NATO. And that's how they feel about it.
And I think the problem isn't so much even the deal in the Ukraine, it's the bigger geostrategic signal that it sends to Putin. I mean, Putin is not only interested in Ukraine, he's interested in a lot of additional states, Moldova, the Baltic states, etc. And then you have to bring up the China question, Xi and Taiwan. And I know you spoke about China. I think next Tuesday I've got something scheduled already in anticipation here of a new government that was going to come in one way or another in the United States, how U.S. policy towards China is going to change. And now we have a concrete thing to talk about with our expert, Dennis Kwok. So be on the lookout for that for next Tuesday. But I think the geostrategic implications that are going to be medium to long term are going to be massive.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more on Ukraine. And that is going to be, especially if he moves quickly to bring them to the table. But he's going to have his hands full in the first couple of weeks. So, I mean, we know he can multitask. But we're talking some pretty big chunks of policy here. And I wanted to go back to one quick thing on crypto again, in that we talked about Sherrod Brown, we talked about Moreno in Ohio, and crypto money. This will be, and then we're going to talk about a few more issues here. This will be the most pro-crypto Congress we've ever seen. So just look, you've got a pro-crypto president, and right now you've got a president on the sidelines on crypto, if not slightly opposed. So you have a pro-crypto president, likely have a pro-crypto elements of his cabinet, sub-cabinet, and then members of Congress. And remember, the industry did work hard to get some of their people elected. So look for some significant changes in crypto policy coming forward.
We talked about tariffs. We talked about crypto. One word I've not heard from you yet is cannabis. How is this new House going to potentially move on cannabis?
Yeah, and I haven't looked at, and I promised Howard Penny I'd do it this morning. We did look at RFK Jr. For a brief moment, and RFK Jr. has indicated that he's very pro cannabis, so legalization as well as cannabis banking. So while I don't think he's going to be the Secretary of HHS or the FDA, I do think he's going to have a health czar type role, I suspect, in the administration. So I think look for the administration to come in with some pro-cannabis policies. What I have yet to look at, Michael, and Howard, if you're listening, is who some of the respective chairmen and chairwomen are going to be on the House and Senate side of the oversight committees, of the committees that oversee this policy. And that's going to be where it all comes together or breaks down. Typically, there have been some hurdles thrown up by Republican senators and some members of the House. Let's see if RFK Jr. can have an impact on Trump and then policy in Washington, D.C. But it's inching in that direction. You just need more Republicans to go with it, and I think it gets over the finish line.
It's a generational shift. We talked about Gen X kind of, really showing itself in this election. And I think along the way, you can see the triumph of crypto, at least being accepted and legitimate, as well as finally getting rid of these lagging federal laws on cannabis when most of the states have, effectively decriminalized it. But a lot of that is a generational lag. It's really sort of this new generation saying this is stupid, even on the Republican side. And I think it's more of a problem for Republicans. Older generation Republicans still have trouble legalizing cannabis. I mean, we had how many candidates in the 1990s and the 00s? I didn't inhale and all.
Yep. Speaking of getting rid of and speaking of generational, just pointed out to me that the biggest hurdle in the United States Senate was Mitch McConnell. So I think with McConnell no longer the Senate majority leader, will not be the next Senate majority leader, I think you might see some more open minds and an open pathway there as well.
Yeah, well, this is the silent generation is gone, by the way. With Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, the last leaders who remember World War II as small children are gone. And so, again, generations constantly move forward with new experiences.
Well, I wanted to close it on a last question, and this might be a big one, but it's also very speculative. Obviously, the Democrats are in need of new leadership. Joe Biden's going to ride off into the sunset here in the next 2 months. I don't know that Kamala Harris has done herself any favors to try to claim any kind of leadership position in the Democratic Party going forward. She was claiming to be the next generation, but who really is going to be the next generation of Democratic leaders that we see
I,
emerging here?
I think you're going to see like
yeah, go ahead, Jay.
yeah, I think you're going to see a crop of Democratic governors emerge, particularly Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. I don't know that Pritzker of Illinois, or that actually makes sense, but you will see a number of Democrat governors from a Senate standpoint or a congressional standpoint. Whether or not Cory Booker dips his toe back in, you're going to see going back to governors. You have Wes Moore of Maryland, who is on a lot of short lists already. So look at Democratic governors, more of the centrist mold, and then a handful of those in the Senate. And yeah, I think they've got a decent bench. And there's, had Trump lost, I think there was a good Republican bench ready as well.
Yep.
Yeah, I find it interesting. If you look at the representation in Congress, particularly in that, well, House and Senate, the Democratic Party has a kind of bimodal age distribution. They have a bunch of older leaders, and they're actually light on Gen Xers. And then they have a lot of millennials coming in, or very late Gen Xers. I think what you're going to see in the Democratic Party is a lot of younger people emerge, very precocious, brilliant, bright people with a strikingly different approach to public policy. But I agree with you. You talk about Cory Booker, and I'm just thinking, my gosh, this just sounds like the primary crew of all these kind of Gen X primary candidates that we saw in 2020. And none of them really lit up you know what I mean? None of them really caught fire very much. One of them was Kamala Harris. And of course, she got the vice presidential spot. And we talk about Gen X being dominant this election, but of course they were dominant. They voted down a member of their own generation, which was Kamala Harris.
I don't think
Democrats just don't have much in that age bracket right now.
I don't think Harris is viable from here on in, frankly. And I'm wondering as we wake up on November 6th, whether or not she still feels that Walz was her best choice as Veep, and whether or not Pennsylvania would have even mattered, given
it did matter. Josh Shapiro wouldn't have saved her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Neil, I'm looking forward to the next 4 years of digging into the next chapter of the fourth turning as we live it live. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interesting conversations we're going to have. Thank you two for joining us. I wanted to thank our viewers and all of Hedgeye Nation who have been with us through this election season. We hope we've been able to bring you some insight that you were not able to get elsewhere. I've gotten a lot of feedback, and I think in many cases that is the case. Obviously, we have a heterogeneous group of followers, and we hope we've been able to give you insights no matter where on the political spectrum you are. And now let's go back to investing and focusing on the realities on the ground, and let the people who got voted last night start working for the American people. I'm curious to see what's going to happen. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day out there, and we will see you soon.